I had not planned to return to this house, and yet here I stood beneath its glittering chandeliers, wearing a mask that concealed everything but the truth beating wildly in my chest. 10 years had passed since I last walked these halls, and still the scent of beeswax candles and winter roses made my hands tremble. The ballroom of Ashford Manor stretched before me like a stage where I had once been invisible, a governess moving through shadows while lords and ladies danced. Now I wore silk instead of wool, a borrowed gown the color of midnight that made me feel like an imposter twice over. The mask I wore was silver and black, shaped like the wing of a bird, covering enough of my face that I might pass unrecognized among the 100 guests who swirled through the room in their own elaborate disguises. I should not have come. Every instinct I possessed had screamed against this desperate act, but desperation has a way of silencing even the loudest voices of reason. My daughter lay ill in a boarding house 3 miles from here, burning with fever, and the physician had been blunt about what it would cost to save her. More money than I could earn in 5 years, more money than existed in my entire world, but not more than existed in his. I watched him from across the room, standing near the marble fireplace with a glass of wine in his hand, his posture as rigid and controlled as I remembered. Count Edmund Ashford had aged well, though perhaps that was what wealth and position did for a man. His dark hair showed only the faintest threads of silver at the temples. His face remained sharp and aristocratic, the kind of face that revealed nothing unless he wished it to. He wore a black mask as well, a simple domino that covered only his eyes, as though even in disguise he could not bear to hide too much of himself. He had not seen me yet. I was just another masked woman at a ball that celebrated concealment, another stranger moving through the crowd. But I knew him in ways these people never would. I knew the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood riding accident. I knew the way his mouth tightened when he was holding back anger. I knew the sound he made in the darkness when desire finally broke through that fortress of control he wore like armor. I knew, too, that he believed I had betrayed him. The music swelled, a waltz that pulled couples onto the floor in spinning pairs of silk and wool. I moved along the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows as I had been trained to do in my years of service. No one looked twice at a woman alone at a masquerade. Mystery was the currency of the evening, and I spent it freely, drawing closer to where he stood with 2 other gentlemen, their conversation low and punctuated by brief laughter. My heart hammered so violently I was certain it must be visible beneath the bodice of my gown. What would I say to him? How did one approach a man 10 years after vanishing from his life without explanation, carrying a secret that could destroy us both? I had rehearsed 1,000 beginnings on the long walk here through the winter cold, but every word now seemed inadequate, foolish, impossible. The child I had borne in secret, the daughter he did not know existed, had his eyes. That same startling shade of gray, like smoke over water. When she looked at me, I saw him looking back, and it broke my heart every single day. One of the gentlemen near the fireplace excused himself, leaving the Count with only a portly man in a ridiculous peacock mask who talked too loudly about investments. I watched Edmund's expression settle into the polite blankness that meant he was bored, but too well-bred to show it. He had always been good at that, at wearing the face society expected while keeping his true self locked away somewhere no one could reach. I had reached it once, or thought I had. The memory came unbidden, sharp as broken glass. His study, late at night, rain lashing against the windows. I had brought him tea because I knew he would work until dawn otherwise, neglecting food and rest in his obsession with the estate ledgers. He had looked up at me with such unexpected warmth, such genuine gratitude, that something in my chest had cracked open. We had talked for hours that night, about books and music and the constraints of duty, about loneliness and the masks we all wore, even without silk and wire to hold them in place. 3 months later, we had become something we should never have become, something impossible and precious and doomed from the start. I drew a breath and started forward, my slippers soundless on the polished wood floor. The peacock man was still talking, gesturing expansively about railway shares. But Edmund's attention had drifted. His gaze moved over the crowd with the detachment of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying a party. His own party, I realized. This masquerade was his, hosted in his home, and he looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. I was 10 feet away when his eyes found me. The recognition was not immediate. How could it be? With my face concealed and my circumstances so utterly transformed. But something made him look twice, his head tilting slightly as though trying to place a melody he had heard long ago. The peacock man continued talking, oblivious, but Edmund was no longer listening. He stared at me across the narrowing distance, and I watched his brow furrow behind the mask. I saw the moment confusion became curiosity, then something sharper. Something almost like hope, quickly buried beneath suspicion. I stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and smoke that clung to his clothing. Close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the white of his knuckles where his hand gripped his wineglass. The peacock man finally noticed the shift in attention and turned to look at me, his expression brightening with the prospect of fresh conversation. He began to speak, some platitude about the success of the evening, but Edmund raised one hand to silence him. The gesture was small but absolute, the command of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His voice, when it came, was lower than I remembered, roughened by time or perhaps by the strain of maintaining composure. He spoke my name as a question, disbelief threading through each syllable. Catherine. Not Miss Hartley, as he had called me when others were present. Not the distant formality we had maintained in daylight. Just my name, naked and raw as though the past 10 years had collapsed in an instant. I could not speak. My throat had closed around words that would not come. I simply stood there, trapped in his gaze, feeling the weight of every choice I had made, every letter I had burned unsent, every night I had held our daughter, and wondered if I had been right to disappear. The peacock man cleared his throat uncomfortably, sensing something beyond his understanding unfolding before him. He murmured an excuse and retreated, leaving us alone in the midst of a room full of people who suddenly seemed very far away. Edmund set down his glass on the mantelpiece with exaggerated care, as though afraid of what his hands might do otherwise. When he looked at me again, his expression had hardened into something cold and cutting. "You have considerable nerve," he said, and though his voice remained quiet, I heard the fury coiled beneath each word. "Coming here, to my home, after what you did." I flinched, but forced myself to meet his gaze. The mask felt like a coward's shield now, something I should cast aside but could not bear to remove. Not yet. Not until I had said what I came to say. I would not have come if there were any other choice, I managed, my voice emerging hoarse and unfamiliar. "I need to speak with you, privately." A bitter laugh escaped him, sharp and humorless. "Privately? Yes. I imagine you would prefer discretion. Tell me, does your husband know you attend masquerade balls alone, seeking private words with other men?" The assumption struck like a physical blow. He thought I had married. Of course he did. What other explanation could there be for a governess who vanished without a word, never to return? He must have imagined me running off to some secret attachment, choosing another man over him, abandoning the impossible love we had shared for something more attainable. If only the truth were so simple. "I have no husband," I said quietly. "I never did." Something flickered across his face, too quick to name, surprise perhaps, or pain. But it vanished beneath the cold mask of his anger, and he took a step closer, near enough that I could feel the heat of him, the terrible proximity of a body I had once known with shameful intimacy. "Then what, Catherine?" His voice dropped lower still, almost a whisper. "Could possibly justify what you did? You left without explanation. Without farewell, without even the courtesy of a letter. I searched for you. I sent inquiries to every corner of England, and you disappeared as though you had never existed at all. The accusation hung between us, and I had no defense that would not expose everything. The child, the fear, the certainty that my presence in his life would destroy his future, his reputation, his chance at a marriage that could secure his family's standing. I had left to protect him from scandal, from the ruin that an affair with a governess would bring. But I could not tell him that without revealing why, and once he knew about our daughter, nothing would ever be the same. I made a choice, I said instead, hating how weak the words sounded. A choice I believed was necessary. His eyes narrowed, and I saw him fighting for control, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The ballroom continued around us, music and laughter floating past like something from a dream. But we stood frozen in our own private hell of unspoken truths and compounding lies. "Take off that mask," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of command. My blood turned to ice. "Edmund." I said, "Take it off." He reached out, his hand moving toward my face, and I knew with absolute certainty that if he removed the mask himself, if he took that choice from me, I would shatter completely. So I did it myself. My hands shook as I reached up and untied the ribbon that held the silver and black wing in place. The mask came away slowly, revealing my face to him inch by inch, and I watched his expression transform as realization settled over him like falling snow. He had recognized my voice, my bearing, perhaps even the way I moved through a room. But seeing my face, older now, marked by years of worry and work and the profound exhaustion of raising a child alone, seemed to steal the breath from his lungs. He staggered back half a step, and the wine glass he had left on the mantelpiece fell to the floor, shattering into bright pieces that scattered across the polished wood. The sound drew attention. Heads turned, conversations paused, and in that terrible moment of exposure, with 100 masked faces turning to look at us, Count Edmund Ashford stared at me as though seeing a ghost risen from the grave he had tried so hard to forget. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. He simply stood there, trapped between rage and anguish and something that might have been longing, all of it written across his face with brutal clarity. I had not meant for it to happen this way. Not in front of his guests. Not with witnesses to record his shock for the gossip mills that would grind this scandal into dust. But fate, it seemed, had no interest in my careful plans. A woman in an elaborate feathered mask approached, her voice bright with false concern. "Lord Ashford, is everything quite all right?" We heard something break. Edmund did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on me, burning with questions I could not answer here, accusations I could not refute in this crowded room. "Everything is fine," he said, though his voice suggested otherwise. "An accident, nothing more." But his hand shot out and gripped my wrist, his fingers closing around it with enough force that I gasped. His touch, after 10 years of absence, felt like fire and ice all at once. "This woman," he announced to the gathered onlookers, his tone carefully neutral despite the violence of his grip, "is an old acquaintance. We have business to discuss, if you will all excuse us." And with that, he pulled me from the ballroom, away from the staring eyes and whispered speculations, into the dark corridors of the house where I had once lived and loved and lost everything that mattered. He did not speak as he led me through the corridors, his grip on my wrist unrelenting, his stride so quick I nearly stumbled trying to keep pace. The sounds of the ballroom faded behind us, replaced by the hollow echo of our footsteps on marble, and then wood as we moved deeper into the private wings of the house. I knew these hallways. I had walked them 1,000 times in another life, carrying tea trays and mending baskets, keeping my eyes lowered and my presence unobtrusive as a good servant should. Now I was being dragged through them like a criminal, and perhaps that was what I was. A thief who had stolen something precious and fled into the night. His trust, his chance to know the truth, 10 years of his life during which he might have known his daughter. Edmund stopped abruptly before a familiar door, the carved oak entrance to his study, and released my wrist only long enough to wrench it open and propel me inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the massive desk positioned before tall windows that looked out over the winter gardens. A fire burned low in the grate, casting shadows that danced across the Persian carpet. He shut the door behind us with enough force that the sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Then he stood with his back to it, blocking my only exit, his chest heaving as though he had run a great distance instead of merely walking down a corridor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I moved toward the center of the room, needing distance from the intensity of his presence, and found myself standing before the desk where we had shared that first dangerous conversation so many years ago. The tea had gone cold while we talked, I remembered. Neither of us had noticed. "Explain," he said finally, and the single word carried the weight of 1,000 questions. "Explain why you left. Explain why you returned. Explain why I should not have you thrown from this house immediately for the trespass of appearing here as though you have any right to my time or attention." I turned to face him, forcing myself to meet his gaze, even though everything in me wanted to look away. His mask was gone now too, discarded somewhere in our flight from the ballroom, and I could see the full force of his anger and hurt written across his features. His hands were fisted at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly I feared he might crack his teeth. "I need your help," I said, because there was no other way to begin, no gentle approach that would soften what I had come to ask. A harsh laugh escaped him. "My help. You vanished for 10 years without a word, and now you return asking for help. The audacity is almost admirable. If there were any other way, I would have taken it." I forced the words past the tightness in my throat. I would not have come back here. I would not have risked seeing you again. Something flickered in his eyes at that, quickly suppressed. "So seeing me is a risk now? What am I to you, Catherine? A danger? A threat? Or merely an inconvenience you hoped never to face again?" The questions landed like blows, each one finding its mark. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the fire. "You have every right to be angry with me. How gracious of you to grant me permission for my own feelings." He moved away from the door finally, stalking across the room with the controlled violence of a caged predator. "Do you have any comprehension of what you did to me? I thought you were dead. For months, I imagined you lying in a ditch somewhere, or drowned, or worse. I hired investigators. I contacted magistrates in 3 counties. I made myself half mad trying to understand what could have happened to you. I had not known that. In my fear and desperation to disappear, I had not considered that he would search for me with such intensity. I had assumed he would be angry, yes, but that he would ultimately accept my departure as proof that whatever had existed between us had been a mistake. A momentary lapse of judgment on both our parts that was better ended quickly and forgotten. I had underestimated what we had been to each other. Or perhaps I had simply lied to myself about it, because the truth was too painful to bear. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I never wanted to cause you pain." He stopped his pacing and turned to look at me with such bitter incredulity that I felt shame burn through me like acid. "You never wanted to cause me pain. Those words, Catherine, are perhaps the cruelest thing you have ever said to me. What did you imagine your disappearance would do? Did you think I would shrug and move on, find another governess to warm my bed, and forget you ever existed?" The crudeness of his words made me flinch, though I knew they came from a place of deep hurt. What we had shared had never been so simple or sordid as he was suggesting, and he knew it. But anger made people cruel, and he had earned the right to his cruelty. "It was not like that," I said quietly. "What we had was not like that." Then what was it like? He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, stopping close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. Tell me, help me understand, because from where I stand, it appears you used me for whatever purpose suited you and discarded me when I was no longer convenient. No. The word burst from me with more force than I intended. That is not what happened. I loved you. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and exposed. I had not meant to say it, not like this, not when I had no right to claim such feelings after what I had done. But the words could not be taken back, and I watched them land on him like a physical blow. His expression shifted, something cracking beneath the armor of his rage. "You loved me," he repeated, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You loved me, and so you left without a word. You loved me, and so you let me believe you were dead or worse. You loved me, and so you denied me even the dignity of understanding why." I had to leave. My hands were shaking now, trembling so badly I had to clasp them together to still them. If I had stayed, I would have destroyed everything you had worked for, everything you were meant to become. What nonsense is this? He reached out and gripped my shoulders, not gently but not violently either, his fingers pressing into the silk of my borrowed gown. "You think so little of me that you believed I would choose reputation over you? Over what we had? It was not about what you would choose." I met his gaze steadily, willing him to understand. "It was about what you deserved, what your family deserved. You were meant to marry well, to secure the estate, to produce heirs with a woman of proper standing. I was a governess, Edmund, a servant in your household. Do you understand what society would have done to you if it became known that you had taken me as a lover? Society be damned." His voice was fierce now, passionate in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. I did not care then, and I do not care now, what those hypocrites in their fine clothes think of me or my choices. But I cared. The words came out softer now, heavy with the grief of old decisions. I cared what would happen to you. I cared about the whispers that would follow you everywhere, the doors that would close, the marriage prospects that would disappear. Your family was depending on you to restore their fortunes through an advantageous match. How could I be the reason you failed them? He released me and turned away, one hand coming up to rake through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration I remembered well. "So you made that choice for me, decided what I could and could not sacrifice, determined that your idea of my happiness was more important than my actual wishes." The accusation stung because it was true. I had played God with both our lives, convinced I was protecting him when perhaps I had merely been protecting myself from the inevitable moment when he would realize that loving me meant giving up too much, that I was not worth the cost. "Did you marry?" I asked, needing to know even though the answer might destroy me. "Did you find the appropriate wife your family required?" His shoulders stiffened, and for a moment I thought he would not answer. Then he turned back to face me, and the expression on his face was one of such profound weariness that my heart ached. "Yes," he said flatly. 3 years after you left, I married Lady Helena Fitzwilliam, the daughter of an earl, impeccable bloodline, substantial dowry. Everything that was expected of me. The pain that lanced through me was sharp and immediate, though I had no right to it. I had left him. I had chosen this outcome. And yet hearing him confirm it, knowing that another woman had stood beside him in a church and taken vows I could never take, felt like being cut open. "Is she here tonight?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded distant and hollow even to my own ears. "Your wife?" Edmund's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the fire. "Helena died 2 years ago. Complications from childbirth. The child died with her. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I reached out blindly for the desk to steady myself, my mind reeling with the weight of his loss. He had suffered so much more than I had known. While I was raising our daughter in quiet obscurity, he had been building a life with someone else, only to have it torn away in the cruelest manner possible. "Edmund," I breathed, "I am so sorry. I did not know. Of course you did not know." He turned back to me, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears that he refused to let fall. "You were not here. You chose not to be here. So you missed it all. My wedding, my wife's death, the years in between when I tried desperately to forget you and failed every single day." The rawness in his voice broke something inside me. I crossed the space between us without thinking, reaching for him, needing to offer comfort, even though I was the last person who had any right to do so. My hand touched his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath the fine fabric of his evening clothes. He caught my wrist again, but this time his grip was different, gentler, almost wondering, as though he could not quite believe I was real and standing before him after all this time. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why come back now, after all these years? What help could you possibly need that would drive you to return to the one place you ran from?" This was the moment, the precipice I had been dreading since I first conceived this desperate plan. I could tell him the truth, reveal the daughter he did not know existed, and watch his entire world shatter again. Or I could lie, invent some other need that would explain my presence without exposing the greatest secret of all. But I was tired of lying, tired of carrying this burden alone, and my daughter, our daughter, was dying. Nothing else mattered more than that. "I have a child," I said, and felt his entire body go rigid beneath my touch. "She is 9 years old. She is ill, desperately ill, and the physician says she will die without proper care. Care that I cannot afford. Care that requires more money than I could earn in a lifetime." His hand released my wrist as though I had burned him. He stepped back, his face going pale in the firelight. "You have a child." The words emerged slowly, each one weighted with dawning comprehension. "A child who is 9 years old." I watched him calculate, saw the moment the mathematics aligned in his mind. 9 years, 10 years since I had left. The timing was impossible to mistake. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw shock, betrayal, and beneath it all, a terrible, fragile hope. "Catherine," he said, and my name on his lips had never sounded so much like a prayer and an accusation combined. "Is she mine?" I could not speak past the knot of tears in my throat, so I simply nodded. Once. A small movement that changed everything. The silence that followed felt infinite. He stared at me as though I had become a stranger, someone he had never known at all. I watched emotions chase across his face too quickly to name. Rage, disbelief, wonder, grief for years lost. And beneath it all, something that looked dangerously like joy. "You kept this from me," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "For 9 years, you kept my child from me. You let me believe I had nothing left of what we shared, when all this time there was a daughter. A daughter who carries my blood, and I never knew she existed. I did what I thought was right." The words sounded weak even to me. "I thought I was protecting you both. Protecting me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only devastation. "You took my child, Catherine. You took the chance to know her, to raise her, to be her father. You took 9 years of her life from me, and you call it protection." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and bitter. I was afraid. I was alone and terrified, and I thought if you knew, you would either force me to give her up or destroy yourself trying to claim her. Either way, the scandal would ruin everything you had built, everything your family needed you to become. So you decided I was better off ignorant, that my daughter was better off fatherless, that you had the right to make that choice for all of us. His voice was rising now, fury breaking through the shock. "What is her name? Tell me at least that much. Tell me the name of the child I should have known from her first breath." "Rose," I whispered. Her name is Rose Catherine Hartley, and she is beautiful and intelligent and kind, and she has your eyes. Every time she looks at me, I see you looking back, and it has been my joy and my torment for 9 years. He turned away from me then, one hand bracing against the mantelpiece, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he could no longer contain. I stood frozen, watching him struggle with the weight of revelations that had shattered whatever remained between us. When he finally spoke again, his voice was hollow. Where is she now? This daughter of mine. Where is Rose? In a boarding house 3 miles from here. I wiped at my tears with the back of my hand, trying to compose myself. She has been fighting a fever for 2 weeks. The physician says it is settling in her lungs. Without proper treatment, without medicine and care in a place that is clean and warm, she will not survive the winter. And you need money for this treatment. His words were flat, almost emotionless now, as though he had exhausted his capacity for feeling. Yes. So you came here, to my ball, wearing a mask and a borrowed gown, planning what? To ask me for charity? To beg the stranger who fathered your child for the funds to save her life? I had no choice. My voice broke on the last word. I have sold everything I own. I have begged from everyone who might help. There is nowhere else to turn. And I know you hate me, Edmund. I know I have given you every reason to despise me. But she is innocent. She has done nothing wrong. And she is yours. He turned to face me then, and the expression on his face was one I could not read. Anger still burned there, yes, but beneath it was something else. Something that might have been determination, or perhaps the first stirrings of a love he did not yet know how to feel for a child he had never met. Take me to her, he said. Now. Tonight. I will see this daughter you have kept from me, and then we will discuss what happens next. The carriage ride through the winter darkness felt interminable. Edmund sat across from me in rigid silence, his face illuminated only by the occasional street lamp we passed. He had called for his driver without a word of explanation to anyone, had simply grabbed his coat and escorted me out through a side entrance as though we were conspirators fleeing some crime. Perhaps we were. The crime of a truth too long buried, now clawing its way into the light. I pulled my borrowed cloak tighter around my shoulders, grateful at least for the warmth it provided against the bitter cold. The streets were quieter now, past midnight, with only the occasional late traveler hurrying home. Most of the city slept, unaware that in this carriage, a man was traveling to meet a daughter whose existence had been hidden from him for 9 years. Edmund had not looked at me since we left Ashford Manor. His gaze remained fixed on the window, watching the darkness slide past, his jaw working as though he were grinding words between his teeth that he dared not speak aloud. I did not blame him for his silence. What could possibly be said in such a moment? What words existed that could bridge the chasm of betrayal and loss and desperate hope that stretched between us? I thought of Rose waiting in that small, cold room, her fever-bright eyes and labored breathing. She had been sleeping when I left, her small hand curled on the threadbare blanket, her dark hair damp with sweat. Mrs. Brennan, the boarding house keeper, had promised to watch her while I was gone, to call for the physician again if the fever worsened. But Mrs. Brennan was old and half-blind, and the physician had made it clear that without proper payment, his visits would cease. I had left my daughter alone to gamble everything on this desperate approach to a man who had every reason to refuse me, who might still refuse me. I realized with a cold twist of fear. Simply because Rose existed did not obligate Edmund to help her. He could decide that the sins of the mother should not determine his responsibility to the child. He could walk away tonight and never look back, leaving us to whatever fate awaited. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was wrong. Edmund Ashford had many faults, but cruelty toward the innocent was not among them. Whatever anger he harbored toward me, however justified his fury, he would not punish Rose for my choices. At least, I prayed he would not. The carriage slowed, and I recognized the narrow street that led to Mrs. Brennan's establishment. It was not the worst part of the city, but it was far from respectable. Boarding houses like this one catered to those who had fallen on hard times, women mostly, with nowhere else to turn. Widows, abandoned mistresses, fallen governesses. We were all the same here, united in our desperation and our determination to survive despite society's judgment. Edmund finally looked at me as the carriage came to a full stop. His eyes held a question he did not voice, and I understood what he was asking. This was his last chance to turn back, to leave this truth unopened, to return to his life of careful control and measured grieving. Once he walked through that door and saw Rose, everything would change. There would be no way to unknow her, no path back to the careful distance he had maintained from all entanglements since his wife's death. "She is on the second floor," I said quietly. "Room 14. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and pushed open the carriage door before the driver could descend to assist. I followed him into the cold night air, my heart hammering so violently I felt lightheaded. The boarding house loomed before us, a narrow building squeezed between two others, its windows mostly dark at this late hour. A single lamp burned by the front entrance, casting weak yellow light across the worn steps. I led Edmund inside, past the small parlor where Mrs. Brennan sat dozing in her chair, up the narrow stairs that creaked under our weight. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, the scent of poverty kept barely at bay. I saw Edmund's nose wrinkle in distaste, and shame burned through me. This was where his daughter lived. This was what I had been able to provide for her. Room 14 was at the end of the hall. I paused with my hand on the door handle, suddenly terrified of what came next. Edmund stood behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, rough and uneven. Waiting. I pushed open the door as quietly as I could, praying Rose would still be asleep. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair positioned near a window that looked out on a brick wall. A stub of candle burned on the bedside table, providing just enough light to see by. And in the bed, beneath a pile of thin blankets, lay Rose. She was not asleep. Her eyes were open, fever bright, and they turned toward us as we entered. Even in illness, even with her face flushed and her breathing labored, she was beautiful. Dark hair spread across the pillow, small features that would grow into loveliness, and those eyes. Those unmistakable gray eyes that marked her as Edmund's daughter as clearly as any declaration could. "Mama," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. "You came back." I crossed to her immediately, kneeling beside the bed and taking her small hand in mine. It was burning hot, her fever worse than when I had left. "Yes, darling, I am here. And I have brought someone to meet you." Rose's gaze drifted past me to where Edmund stood frozen in the doorway. I saw confusion flicker across her small face, then wariness. She had learned to be cautious around strangers, as all children in our position must. But there was curiosity, too, the natural interest of a child confronted with something unexpected. Edmund moved forward slowly, as though approaching a wild creature that might bolt if startled. He came to stand at the foot of the bed, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. I watched him study her, drinking in every detail, the shape of her nose, the curve of her mouth, the way her fingers curled around mine, small and fragile. "Hello, Rose," he said finally, and his voice was gentler than I had heard it all evening, soft and careful, as though he feared the sound alone might shatter her. "My name is Edmund. I am a friend of your mother's." Rose looked at me for confirmation, and I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. She turned her attention back to Edmund, her gaze solemn and assessing in the way only children can manage. "Are you the Count?" she asked, and I felt my breath catch. Mama told me about a count once. She said he lived in a grand house with 100 rooms and more books than anyone could read in a lifetime. Edmund's eyes found mine, startled and searching. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I had told Rose stories, carefully edited versions of truth disguised as fairy tales, about a kind count who loved books and gardens, who was lonely despite his wealth, who had a good heart beneath his stern exterior. I had given her father to her in the only way I could, through stories told at bedtime when she asked about the man who had given her his eyes. "I do live in a rather large house," Edmund said, and there was wonder in his voice now, mixing with the pain. "And yes, I have quite a few books." "Do you like books, Rose?" A weak smile touched her lips. "Mama teaches me to read. I like stories about adventures. And horses. Do you have horses?" "Many horses." Edmund moved closer, until he stood beside me at her bedside. "Perhaps when you are feeling better, you might like to see them." Rose's smile grew, but then a coughing fit seized her, shaking her small frame violently. I helped her sit up, supporting her as she struggled to breathe. The sound was wet and rattling, the kind of cough that spoke of fluid in the lungs and infections taking hold. When it finally subsided, she collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and trembling. Edmund's face had gone pale. "How long has she been like this?" he demanded, his physician's instinct overriding everything else. 2 weeks, I said quietly. "But it has gotten worse in the last few days. The physician says her lungs are compromised, that without proper medicine and care in a warm, clean environment, the infection will spread." He reached out then, slowly, and placed his hand on Rose's forehead. She did not flinch from his touch, too tired to be cautious anymore. His jaw tightened as he felt the heat radiating from her skin. "This fever is dangerously high." He looked at me with something that might have been accusation, or simply fear. "She needs to be in a proper bed, in a heated room with round-the-clock nursing. She needs medicines that I doubt have been administered here." "I have done everything I could with what I had," I said, and heard the defensiveness in my own voice. "Do you think I wanted her to suffer? Do you imagine I enjoyed watching her waste away while I counted pennies and prayed for miracles?" His expression softened fractionally. "I know. But she cannot stay here, not another night. We leave immediately." "To where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer and feared it in equal measure. "To Ashford Manor." He said it as though it were obvious, as though there were no complications that might prevent such a thing. "She will have the best care available, the finest physicians in the city, whatever is needed to ensure her recovery." Rose stirred at the mention of leaving, her eyes struggling to focus. "Am I going to the house with 100 rooms?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edmund looked down at her, and I saw his face transform. The anger and betrayal that had marked his features since the moment of revelation seemed to melt away, replaced by something raw and unguarded, something that looked dangerously like love. "Yes," he said, and his voice broke on the word. "You are coming to my house, and you will have the finest room there, with windows that overlook the gardens and more blankets than you could ever need, and anything else your heart desires." A single tear tracked down Rose's flushed cheek. "Will Mama come too?" Edmund's eyes found mine, and in them I saw the question he had not yet asked. The decision that loomed before us both, with implications that reached far beyond this single night. If Rose came to Ashford Manor, if she was installed there as his daughter, the scandal would be immediate and devastating. Everyone would know what we had been to each other. The whispers I had feared 10 years ago would become shouts that echoed through every drawing room in the city. But the alternative was watching our daughter die in this miserable room, and that was no alternative at all. "Of course your mama will come," Edmund said firmly, making the choice for both of us. "She will stay with you and help you get well. That is all that matters now." I felt something break open in my chest, relief and terror mingling until I could not tell them apart. He was saving Rose. He was bringing us both into his home, into his life, and accepting whatever consequences would follow. It was more than I had any right to ask for, more than I deserved after what I had done to him. Rose's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion pulling her under despite her efforts to stay awake. Edmund stood watching her for a long moment, his hand still resting gently on her forehead, as though he could will his own strength into her small body through touch alone. "I will carry her to the carriage," he said quietly. "Gather whatever belongings you have here. We leave within the quarter hour." I moved through the room in a daze, collecting the few possessions we owned. A spare dress for Rose, carefully mended in a dozen places, the wooden doll I had carved for her 3rd birthday, the primer we used for reading lessons. Everything we had fit into a single carpet bag, the sum total of 9 years of life reduced to what could be carried in one hand. Edmund lifted Rose with a gentleness that made my throat tight. She stirred, but did not wake, her head falling against his shoulder with the unconscious trust of a child too sick to question who held her. I saw his arms tighten around her, saw the way he looked down at her face with an expression of such fierce protectiveness that it took my breath away. This was what I had stolen from him. Not just knowledge of Rose's existence, but years of moments like this. The first time she smiled, the first words she spoke, the scraped knees and childhood fears and small triumphs that made up a life. I had taken all of it, convinced I was doing right, and now faced the undeniable truth that I had been catastrophically wrong. We descended the stairs in silence. Mrs. Brennan had woken at the sound of our movement and stood in the hallway, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. I pressed the last of my coins into her hand, payment for the weeks we had stayed, and murmured an explanation about a family emergency. She nodded, but her gaze lingered on Edmund with open curiosity. By morning, the entire boarding house would know that Catherine Hartley had left in the night with a wealthy man and her sick daughter. The assumptions would spread like wildfire, but I found I did not care. Let them think what they wished. Rose would be safe, and that was all that mattered. The carriage waited where we had left it, the driver's face carefully neutral as Edmund handed Rose up to me and then climbed in himself. I settled our daughter across my lap, her head resting against my chest, and felt Edmund's gaze on us in the darkness. "She looks like you," he said softly. "When you are not looking, when your face is unguarded. I see you in her expressions, the way she tilts her head when she is thinking, the shape of her hands." "She has your stubbornness," I replied, surprised to find myself almost smiling. "And your intelligence. She questions everything, wants to understand how things work. The world is not given to her as fact, but as puzzle to be solved." Something that might have been pride flickered across his features. Then the practical side of his nature reasserted itself. "When we arrive at the manor, I will send immediately for Dr. Whitmore. He is the best physician in the city and a personal friend. He will know what treatments are required." "Thank you," I whispered, the inadequacy of the words almost painful. "Thank you for this, for helping her. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but she is innocent in all of this. Whatever you decide about me, please do not punish her for my mistakes." Edmund leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face very close to mine in the confined space of the carriage. "What I decide about you," he said slowly, "is not something to be determined tonight. Right now, my daughter is ill and needs care. That is my only concern. Everything else, all the questions and reckonings and decisions about what comes next, will have to wait. But make no mistake, Catherine." He held my gaze, and I saw steel beneath the gentleness. "We will have that reckoning. You will answer for every year you kept her from me, for every choice you made that denied me the right to know my own child. But not tonight. Tonight, we focus on Rose." I nodded, accepting the reprieve for what it was. Temporary, fragile, bought with the currency of our daughter's illness. When Rose recovered, as I prayed she would, Edmund and I would have to face everything we had left unresolved. The love that still existed between us, damaged but not destroyed. The betrayal that could not be undone. The future that seemed impossible to navigate, but equally impossible to avoid. The carriage rolled through the dark streets toward Ashford Manor, carrying 3 people bound together by blood and history and choices that could never be unmade. Rose slept in my arms, her breathing labored but steady. Edmund sat across from us, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, as though he could memorize a lifetime of missed moments in a single night. And I held them both in my heart, knowing that whatever came next would reshape all our lives in ways I could not predict or control. I had sought to protect Edmund by leaving. Instead, I had only prolonged the inevitable confrontation with truth. Now that truth rode with us through the winter darkness, small and fever-bright and more powerful than any lie could ever be. The manor's lights appeared ahead, warm and welcoming against the cold night sky. Home, I thought, though it had never truly been mine. But perhaps for Rose, it could be. Perhaps she would grow up in those 100 rooms with their 1,000 books, knowing safety and comfort and, most importantly, a father's love. If we could all survive what came after. The guest room Edmund chose for Rose was on the eastern side of the manor, where morning light would flood through tall windows and illuminate walls painted a soft cream. It had been prepared for her within the hour, fires lit in both the bedroom and adjoining sitting room, fresh linens placed on a bed large enough for 3 children. A copper bathtub had been filled with warm water, scented with lavender, and nightgowns of the finest cotton waited on the chair, borrowed from some distant cousin's child and altered hastily by the housekeeper. I had not expected such efficiency. I had forgotten what wealth could accomplish when directed with purpose. Within moments of our arrival, the entire household had been roused and set to work. Servants I half recognized from my time here moved through the corridors with quiet urgency, carrying coal and linens and basins of steaming water. No one questioned Edmund's orders. No one dared ask who the sick child was or why their master had brought her here in the middle of the night. But I saw them looking, saw the swift glances exchanged between maids, the way the butler's eyebrows rose fractionally when Edmund carried Rose through the entrance hall. They would talk, of course. Servants always did. By morning, everyone in the household would know that Count Ashford had returned from his masquerade ball with a former governess and a child who bore a striking resemblance to him. The speculation would spread from there, rippling outward until it reached every drawing room in the city. Let it spread, I thought, with a recklessness born of exhaustion and relief. Let them all know. Rose would be safe, and that was worth any scandal. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, a silver-haired gentleman with kind eyes and steady hands. He examined Rose thoroughly while Edmund and I stood by, too anxious to sit, too afraid to look away. I watched the physician's face for any sign of his prognosis, but he maintained professional neutrality until the examination was complete. "The fever is indeed dangerous," he said finally, washing his hands in the basin a maid had provided. "And there is fluid in her lungs, as you suspected. But she is young and otherwise healthy. With proper care and the right medications, I am cautiously optimistic about her recovery. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it left me lightheaded. I felt Edmund's hand on my elbow, steadying me, and was grateful for it, even as I resented needing his support." Dr. Whitmore outlined a treatment plan that involved regular doses of medicine, cool compresses for the fever, steam inhalations to ease her breathing, and complete bed rest. He promised to return twice daily to monitor her progress and adjust treatment as needed. After the physician departed, Edmund and I stood on opposite sides of Rose's bed, watching her sleep. The laudanum Dr. Whitmore had administered had eased her breathing, and she looked more peaceful than I had seen her in weeks. Her dark hair had been brushed and braided by one of the maids, and she wore a white nightgown with lace at the collar that made her look younger than her 9 years. She is so small, Edmund said quietly. I had forgotten how small children are, how fragile. I looked at him across the bed and saw something in his face that twisted my heart. Grief, yes, for the years he had missed, but also fear, raw and unconcealed, at the thought of losing her before he had truly known her. He had lost a wife and child to death once already. The prospect of losing another child must have been almost unbearable. She is stronger than she looks, I said, though I was not certain if I was trying to reassure him or myself. She has survived poverty and hardship and a mother who could not always provide for her. She will survive this too, because she has you. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw something I had not expected. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Whatever I think of your choices, Catherine, however angry I am at what you took from me, I cannot deny that you kept her alive. You raised her alone with no support, no resources, no one to help you. That takes a strength I am not certain I possess. The praise felt unearned, almost painful. I did what any mother would do. Nothing extraordinary, just what was necessary. No. He shook his head firmly. Most women in your position would have given the child up, left her at a foundling hospital, or paid someone to take her. Society would have expected it, even demanded it. But you kept her. You chose the harder path because you loved her more than you feared the consequences. I had never considered that what I did might be seen as brave rather than simply inevitable. Rose was mine, born of my body and the love I had shared with this man. How could I have given her away? How could any price have been worth that loss? A soft knock interrupted whatever I might have said in response. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morris, appeared in the doorway with an expression of careful neutrality that did not quite mask her curiosity. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but I have prepared a room for Miss Hartley as well. The blue room, just down the hall. I thought perhaps she might want to rest after such a trying evening." "Thank you, Mrs. Morris." Edmund's tone was dismissive, but not unkind. "That will be all for tonight." The housekeeper curtsied and withdrew, but not before her gaze flickered to me with unmistakable assessment. She remembered me, I realized, remembered the young governess who had worked here years ago. She would have questions, and when those questions went unanswered, she would supply her own answers. The whole household would. "You should rest," Edmund said after Mrs. Morris had gone. "You look exhausted. I cannot leave her." The thought of being separated from Rose, even by a single room, was intolerable. What if her fever worsens? What if she wakes and I am not here? Then we will both stay. He moved to the sitting room and returned with 2 chairs, positioning them on either side of Rose's bed. "We can take turns keeping watch. You sleep first. I will wake you if anything changes." The reasonableness of this suggestion made arguing impossible, though every instinct screamed against accepting help from him. I had grown accustomed to doing everything alone, to relying on no one but myself. Allowing Edmund to share this vigil felt dangerously like dependence, like admitting I could not manage without him. But I was so tired, bone-tired, soul-tired, tired in ways that sleep might not even touch. And Rose needed me rested and capable, not half mad with exhaustion. I sank into the chair Edmund had placed for me, my muscles aching with relief at being allowed to stop moving. He settled into his own chair across from me, his posture upright despite the late hour. Between us, Rose breathed slowly and steadily, the sound of fragile comfort. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for all of this, for believing me when I had given you no reason to trust anything I said, for helping her, even though you had every right to refuse. She is my daughter." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. Whatever exists between us, whatever must be resolved, that fact remains unchanged. I will always help her, always protect her. That is not gratitude owed, but simply what a father does. The word father on his lips applied to himself in relation to Rose, made something ache deep in my chest. For 9 years I had been both mother and father to her, filling 2 roles inadequately. Now she would have what I could never give her alone. A father who could provide not just money, but protection, standing, legitimacy. All the things I had feared he would never be able to offer without destroying himself. Perhaps I had been wrong about that too. Perhaps his love was stronger than society's judgment, his will more powerful than their whispers. I had underestimated him once by leaving. I would not make that mistake again. The hours passed in silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Rose's soft breathing. I must have dozed, because I woke to find morning light filtering through the curtains and Edmund gone from his chair. Panic seized me until I saw him standing at the window, looking out over the grounds with his back to the room. He had removed his evening coat and loosened his cravat, the informal state making him look younger somehow, more like the man I had known 10 years ago. His shoulders were tense, his posture speaking of thoughts that gave no rest. I rose quietly and went to check Rose. Her forehead was cooler than it had been, the fever broken or at least diminished. Relief made my knees weak. She was going to live. The treatment was working. My daughter would survive this. Edmund must have heard my movement because he turned from the window. His eyes went immediately to Rose, and I saw hope kindle in his expression. The fever has lessened, I confirmed. Dr. Whitmore was right. She is improving. He crossed to the bed and placed his hand on Rose's forehead, needing to confirm it for himself. When he straightened, some of the tension had left his frame. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, as though the words had been carefully chosen over hours of consideration, about what happens next, about Rose's future and what is best for her. My stomach tightened with dread. Whatever he had decided, I would have to accept. He had the power now, the resources and the legal standing. I was still just a former servant who had borne a child out of wedlock. If he chose to take Rose from me, to raise her himself while sending me away, I would have no recourse. "She needs a father," he continued. "That much is indisputable, but she needs her mother too. She loves you, trusts you, has known no other parent. To separate you would harm her, and I will not allow that." I hardly dared to breathe. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you will both stay here, permanently." He met my gaze steadily. "Rose will be acknowledged as my daughter and raised with all the advantages that status confers. And you will remain with her, not as a servant, but as her mother." "The scandal will be enormous," I said, needing him to understand what he was offering to endure. "Everyone will know what we were to each other. Your reputation will suffer. You will be cut by people whose opinions you value. Let them cut me." His voice was hard now, edged with the same determination I had seen when he decided to bring Rose to the manor. "I spent 10 years trying to live according to society's rules. I married appropriately. I played the part expected of me. And what did it bring me? A loveless marriage and a wife who died bearing a child who died with her. I am done caring what those people think. But your family, your position. My position is secure by birth and cannot be taken from me. As for my family," he gave a bitter smile, "most of them are dead or too distant to matter. I answer to no one but myself now, Catherine, and I choose to acknowledge my daughter, whatever the cost." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This was more than I had hoped for, more than I deserved after what I had taken from him. But accepting it meant binding myself to him permanently, living under his roof and his authority, forever in his debt. "I will not live here as your mistress," I said quietly but firmly, "if that is what you expect in exchange for your protection." His expression hardened. "I expect nothing of the sort. Whatever we were to each other is in the past. You will have your own rooms, your own household allowance, complete independence within the bounds of propriety. You are Rose's mother, nothing more and nothing less." The words should have brought relief, but instead carved a hollow space in my chest. Nothing more. Once I had been everything to him, or so I had believed. Now I was merely the inconvenient mother of his child, to be tolerated for Rose's sake, but never again desired or loved. It was what I deserved, I reminded myself. I had made my choices. I would live with the consequences. A soft sound drew our attention back to the bed. Rose's eyes had opened, and she was looking at us with the clarity of reduced fever. Her gaze moved from me to Edmund and back again, taking in our proximity and perhaps sensing the tension that hummed between us. "Mama," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than yesterday. "Is this the house with 100 rooms?" "Yes, darling." I moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand. "This is Lord Ashford's home. You are going to stay here until you are well." "And after?" she asked with the directness of children. "Where will we go after I am well?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain what Edmund had proposed, but he answered before I could. "You will stay here after, too," he said gently, moving to stand at the foot of the bed. "This will be your home for as long as you wish, you and your mother both." Rose studied him with those unsettling gray eyes that were so like his own. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you let us stay in your house?" Edmund glanced at me, a question in his eyes. I gave a small nod. She deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as she could understand at 9 years old. "Because," Edmund said slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed so he was at Rose's level, "you are my daughter. And this is your home because it is mine, and what is mine belongs to you as well." Rose's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "You are my father?" "The man from Mama's stories." I felt my face flush, but Edmund only smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since I had returned to his life. "I hope the stories were not too terrible," he said. "They were good stories," Rose assured him seriously. "Mama said you were kind and loved books and had a garden with roses. Is that true?" "All true, though I confess I did not know your mother named you after my favorite flowers." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw wonder and hurt and forgiveness all tangled together in a knot I could not begin to unravel. I had given our daughter his name in the only way I could, a secret message he was only now receiving 9 years late. Rose seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful. "Does being your daughter mean I do not have to go back to the boarding house?" "You never have to go back there," Edmund said firmly. "You will live here, in this beautiful room, and learn to ride horses and read as many books as you like. And you will always be safe and cared for. And Mama, too?" Rose's hand tightened around mine. "Mama stays with me." "Always," Edmund promised, though his eyes were still on me. "Your mother will never leave you." But the unspoken truth hung in the air between us. I would never leave Rose, but Edmund and I, that was another matter entirely. We were bound now by our daughter, forced into proximity, but separated by the weight of betrayal and loss. He would be a father to Rose, but what we had once been to each other was buried in the past, dead as his first wife and the child he had lost. It had to be enough, I told myself. Rose would grow up knowing both her parents, raised in comfort and security. She would have opportunities I could never have given her alone. My sacrifice of any chance at rekindling what Edmund and I once shared was a small price for her happiness, even if it meant living every day in the house of the man I still loved, watching him be kind and generous to our daughter while maintaining a careful distance from me, even if it meant seeing him eventually marry again, bringing another woman into this house to be stepmother to Rose, even if it meant growing old in the shadow of a love that could never be resurrected. I had made my choices 10 years ago. Now I would live with them, grateful for what remained, even as I mourned what could never be recovered. Rose's eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion pulling her back into healing sleep. Edmund stood and moved away from the bed, and I followed him into the sitting room, closing the door partway so we could talk without disturbing her. "She seems to be accepting this quite well," he observed. "I expected more resistance, or at least more questions." "She is a child who has always wanted a father," I said quietly, "who has asked me 100 times why she did not have one like other children did." I could never give her a good answer, so I gave her stories instead. Now the stories are real, and she is too young to understand how complicated the truth actually is. She will have questions eventually. Edmund's gaze was steady. About why we are not married, about why you left, about what it means that she was born outside of wedlock. I know, and when she is old enough, I will answer them honestly. I will not lie to her about my choices or their consequences. Our choices, he corrected. I was not some innocent victim in this, Catherine. I knew what we risked every time I came to your room. I knew the danger, and I did it anyway because I wanted you more than I feared the consequences. The admission hung between us, raw and dangerous. We had never spoken so plainly about what we had shared, even when we were together. The affair had been conducted in silence and shadow, stolen moments that ended before dawn. We had never named what existed between us, never dared to call it love, though we both knew it was. And now it was too late. Too much time had passed, too much damage done. We could not go back to what we were, and we could not move forward into anything new. We were trapped in this strange purgatory of proximity without intimacy, bound by a child, but separated by history. I should check on her temperature again, I said, needing to escape the weight of his gaze and the memories it stirred. Dr. Whitmore said to monitor it closely. I moved past him back into the bedroom, and he did not follow. When I glanced back, he was standing at the window again, his profile sharp against the morning light, looking every inch the aristocrat he was born to be, remote and untouchable, separated from me by more than just the width of a room. This was how it would be, I realized, this careful distance, this polite coexistence. We would be civil for Rose's sake, but the passion that had once consumed us was ashes now, scattered by time and betrayal and the impossibility of forgiveness. I settled back into the chair beside Rose's bed and took her small hand in mine, anchoring myself to the one pure and uncomplicated love in my life. Whatever else I had lost, I still had her. And Edmund had gained a daughter even as he lost me a second time. Perhaps that was justice. Perhaps that was what we both deserved. A daughter to love and raise together. And the permanent reminder of what we had once been to each other, visible in every feature of her face, but forever out of reach between us. 3 weeks passed before Rose was well enough to leave her bed for more than brief intervals. 3 weeks during which I watched my daughter transform from a pale, fever-racked child into something closer to the vibrant girl she had been before illness struck. Her laughter returned first, then her endless questions, and finally her energy, that boundless curiosity that sent her exploring every corner of her new home with wide-eyed wonder. Edmund was there for all of it. Every morning he came to her room before breakfast, bringing books from his library or stories about the estate. He taught her to play chess using an ivory set that had belonged to his grandfather. He carried her to the window so she could watch the horses in the paddock, promising that as soon as Dr. Whitmore gave permission, he would teach her to ride. He was patient and gentle and utterly devoted. Everything I had always believed he would be as a father, if given the chance. And he was scrupulously polite to me, distant but never unkind. He asked after my comfort, ensured I had everything I needed, consulted me on every decision regarding Rose's care. But he never touched me, never allowed our hands to brush accidentally, never looked at me with anything more than the courteous regard one might show a respected governess, which was, I supposed, all I deserved to be in his eyes now. The scandal I had feared erupted exactly as predicted. Within days of our arrival at Ashford Manor, the whispers had spread throughout the city. The masquerade ball where the Count had been seen confronting a mysterious woman. his sudden departure with her, the child who now resided in his home, bearing his unmistakable features. The servants talked, and their talk reached other households, and soon everyone who mattered knew or suspected the truth. Some of Edmund's acquaintances stopped calling. Certain invitations that would have once arrived, as a matter of course, simply did not materialize. I saw the pain this caused him, though he never spoke of it, never gave any indication that he regretted his choice to acknowledge Rose. But I felt it nonetheless, the weight of my presence in his life and the damage it did to his standing. On the 18th day of our residence at the manor, Lady Margaret Ashford came to call. Edmund's aunt, a formidable woman in her 60s who had never approved of his first marriage and certainly would not approve of his current situation. I heard her arrival from Rose's room, heard the sharp commands she gave to the butler, and knew with sinking certainty that she had come to force a confrontation. Edmund asked me to join them in the drawing room, and I could not refuse. I left Rose with one of the maids and descended the stairs with my heart pounding, preparing myself for the judgment I knew awaited. Lady Margaret sat in the largest chair like a queen on a throne, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her black dress severe and uncompromising. She looked at me as I entered, and her expression was everything I expected. Contempt, disappointment, and beneath it all, a kind of grim satisfaction that her predictions about Edmund's poor judgment had been proven correct. "So this is the governess," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The woman who has destroyed what remained of this family's reputation. Aunt Margaret." Edmund's voice was cold. "You will speak respectfully to Miss Hartley, or you will leave immediately. Respectfully." She laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You expect me to show respect to a woman who bore your bastard child, and then had the audacity to return demanding your support? You expect me to pretend this situation is anything other than a disaster? I expect you to remember that Rose is my daughter and your blood relation." Edmund remained standing, his posture rigid. "She is an innocent child who deserves none of your scorn. Whatever judgments you wish to pass, direct them at me, not at her or her mother." "Oh, I have judgments aplenty for you, nephew." Lady Margaret's eyes blazed. "You had a chance to rebuild this family's standing. Your wife was dead, yes, tragic, but you were young enough to marry again. An alliance with the Pemberton family was all but arranged. Lady Alice would have been a perfect match, wealthy, well-bred, unimpeachable reputation. And you have thrown it all away for what? A moment of nostalgia for a youthful indiscretion? Rose is not an indiscretion." Edmund's voice dropped dangerously low. "She is my daughter, and I will not abandon her to satisfy your ideas about appropriate behavior. Then you are a fool." Lady Margaret stood, gathering her reticule with sharp, angry movements. "You think you can simply acknowledge a bastard child and continue as though nothing has changed? Society will never accept this. You will be cut from every respectable household. Your daughter will grow up marked by shame, unable to marry well, unable to take her place in the world you claim to be protecting her for." The words struck like physical blows because they contained uncomfortable truths. Rose would bear the stigma of illegitimacy all her life. No matter how much Edmund loved her, no matter what advantages he provided, she would always be the Count's bastard daughter. The scandal would follow her into adulthood, limiting her prospects, defining her in ways that were profoundly unfair. Unless there was another way. I stepped forward before I could reconsider, my voice steady, despite my trembling hands. "Lady Margaret is right," I said, and saw Edmund's head whip toward me in surprise. "Rose will suffer for the circumstances of her birth. That is an unavoidable truth." "Catherine," Edmund began, but I shook my head, silencing him. "However," I continued, meeting Lady Margaret's gaze directly, "there is a solution that would legitimize Rose and end the scandal you find so distressing. Lord Ashford and I could marry." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Margaret stared at me as though I had suggested something obscene. Edmund had gone very still, his face unreadable. "Marry you," Lady Margaret finally said, her voice dripping with disdain. Marry a governess, a woman who abandoned him once and returned only when she needed his money. That is your solution? It would make Rose legitimate, I said, forcing myself to continue, despite the humiliation burning through me. The marriage would be one of convenience only, undertaken solely for her benefit, but it would give her your family name without the taint of illegitimacy. It would end the speculation and perhaps salvage some of Lord Ashford's standing. Absolutely not. Edmund's voice was sharp, final. I will not discuss this. Why not? I turned to face him, needing him to understand. You said yourself that Rose deserves every advantage. Marriage would provide that. It would protect her in ways that acknowledgement alone cannot. You think I would marry you out of obligation? His eyes were blazing now, furious in a way I had not seen since that first night, that I would reduce what we had to a convenient arrangement for the sake of appearances. What we had is dead, I said quietly, brutally. You have made that clear through weeks of careful distance. But Rose deserves parents who are married, who can give her legitimacy and security. My pride is not more important than her future. This is madness. Lady Margaret looked between us with something approaching horror. Edmund, surely you cannot be considering this. A marriage of convenience to a woman who betrayed you would be the final humiliation. But Edmund was not looking at his aunt. His gaze remained fixed on me, searching my face for something I could not name. When he spoke, his voice was different, raw and unguarded. Is that truly what you think? That I have been distant because what we had is dead? That I feel nothing but obligation toward you? I stared at him, confused by the pain in his voice. What else could I think? You have barely looked at me for 3 weeks. You speak to me with perfect politeness and nothing more. You have made it clear that I am tolerated for Rose's sake, but wanted for nothing else, because I did not trust myself to do otherwise. He took a step toward me, and then another, closing the distance between us with deliberate intensity. Because every time I look at you, I remember what we had and what you took from me, and I do not know whether to rage at you or beg you to let me love you again. Because I have spent 10 years trying to forget you and failed, and having you here in my home, seeing you every day, is the sweetest torture I have ever endured. The admission hung in the air between us, so unexpected that I could barely process it. He still felt something for me. After everything, after all the betrayal and loss and wasted years, he still felt something beyond anger. Lady Margaret made a sound of disgust. This is precisely the kind of emotional indulgence that led to this disaster in the first place. Edmund, I am telling you as the head of this family that marrying this woman would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Then I will make that mistake gladly. Edmund's eyes never left mine. Because I am tired of living according to rules that brought me nothing but misery. I married appropriately once, Aunt Margaret. I did everything society expected, and I lost everything that mattered anyway. If I am to be condemned, let it be for choosing what I actually want rather than what others demand of me. And what do you want? The question emerged as barely a whisper. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and took my hand in his. His touch, after weeks of careful avoidance, sent electricity through me. I want Rose to be legitimate, he said. I want her to grow up, knowing she is wanted and loved and has every right to the name she bears. But I also want you, Catherine. I want the chance to build what we should have built 10 years ago. I want to be angry at you for leaving and forgive you for it in the same breath. I want mornings and evenings and every moment in between. I want a life, not merely an existence. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and uncontrollable. I do not deserve this. I do not deserve your forgiveness or your love. What I did to you was unforgivable. Perhaps. His thumb brushed across my knuckles in a gesture so tender it broke something open in my chest. But I am choosing to forgive you anyway. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger has brought me nothing but loneliness. And because our daughter needs parents who are united, not divided by old wounds. This is madness, Lady Margaret repeated, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. You will both be ruined. We are already ruined by society's standards, Edmund said, without looking away from me. The question is whether we will be ruined separately or together. I prefer together. I could not speak past the tears, could not form words adequate to what I felt. So I simply nodded once and watched his face transform with relief and something that looked dangerously like joy. Lady Margaret rose with an expression of profound disapproval. I wash my hands of this disaster. When you find yourselves completely ostracized, with no one of quality willing to receive you, do not come crying to me for assistance. Then it is fortunate, Edmund said mildly, finally turning to address his aunt, that we will have each other for company. I am certain we will manage quite well. She swept from the room in a rustle of black silk, her disapproval palpable even in absence. The door closed behind her, and Edmund and I were left standing hand in hand in the sudden quiet. I am not asking for a marriage of convenience, he said softly. I need you to understand that. If we do this, it will be a real marriage, with all that entails. What are you asking for then? I needed to hear him say it. Needed the clarity of words, even though his touch spoke volumes. I am asking if you could love me again. His free hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing away tears. Or if you ever stopped. Because I never stopped loving you, Catherine. Not in 10 years of trying. Not through marriage to another woman. Not through death and grief and loneliness. You have been the constant in my heart even when you were absent from my life. I never stopped, I whispered. I loved you every day we were apart. Every time I looked at Rose and saw your eyes. Every night I lay awake wondering if I had made the right choice by leaving. I loved you, and it was agony, and I would not have changed it because the alternative was destroying you. You were wrong about that. His voice was gentle but firm. You did not save me by leaving. You only postponed the reckoning. But we are here now, and we have a choice. We can let the past define us, or we can choose something new. What about Rose? I asked. Should we not consider what she wants? As if summoned by her name, a small voice spoke from the doorway. I want you to get married. We both turned to find Rose standing there in her nightgown, one of the maids hovering anxiously behind her. She must have crept down from her room to listen, drawn by the raised voices and adult drama. Her gray eyes were wide and serious as she looked between us. Rose, I began, but she interrupted with the confidence of a child who knows her own mind. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house said children need 2 parents. She said it was sad that I only had a mama and no papa. But now I have a papa too, and if you get married, we can be a proper family. So I think you should. The simple logic of a 9-year-old, cutting through all our complicated adult emotions and arriving at the obvious conclusion. Edmund and I looked at each other, and I saw my own amazement reflected in his face. We had been so focused on our own pain that we had almost overlooked the most important perspective of all. Edmund released my hand and crossed to Rose, kneeling so he was at her level. If your mama and I marry, he said seriously, it means we will all live together as a family. But it also means that society might be unkind to us. Some people will say cruel things about you and your mother and me. Are you prepared for that? Rose considered this with the gravity it deserved. Will I still get to read your books and learn to ride horses? Yes. And will Mama be happy? Edmund glanced back at me. I believe she will be. Then I do not care what other people say, Rose declared. Mama always told me that what matters is being kind and truthful, not what others think of you. If we are a family and we are kind to each other, that is enough. Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that shamed us all. I crossed to where Edmund knelt beside Rose and placed my hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw a question and a promise. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not for obligation or convenience, but because I love you and I believe you love me. Marry me, and let us be the family Rose deserves, the family we all deserve." "Yes," I said, and felt the word reshape my entire world. "Yes, I will marry you." Rose launched herself at both of us with a delighted squeal, wrapping her small arms around our necks and pulling us into an awkward three-person embrace. We tumbled slightly, unbalanced, and then we were laughing, all of us, laughing with relief and joy and the sheer improbability of this moment. The maid who had followed Rose discreetly withdrew, no doubt racing to spread the news throughout the household. By evening, all of London would know that Count Ashford intended to marry his former governess and legitimize his daughter. The scandal would be enormous, the gossip relentless. We would lose friendships and standing, and perhaps much more. But as I knelt there on the drawing-room floor with Edmund's arm around my waist and Rose's laughter in my ears, I found I did not care. Let them talk, let them judge. We would weather it together, the three of us, bound by love and choice rather than obligation. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the private chapel at Ashford Manor. Only a handful of people attended, mostly servants and the few friends loyal enough to stand with us despite society's disapproval. Dr. Whitmore came, and to everyone's surprise, Lady Margaret appeared as well, her expression still disapproving, but her presence a tacit acceptance that what was done could not be undone. Rose stood beside me in a new dress, the color of spring roses, her dark hair adorned with flowers from the garden. She took her role as witness with absolute seriousness, watching every moment of the ceremony as though committing it to memory. When the vicar pronounced us married, she clapped with such enthusiasm that several guests laughed despite the solemnity of the moment. Edmund kissed me for the first time in 10 years, his lips gentle against mine, and I tasted salt from tears I had not realized I was crying. When we pulled apart, his hand came up to cradle my face, and he whispered words only I could hear. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for bringing Rose to me. Thank you for giving me a second chance at happiness." "I should be thanking you," I replied. "You could have turned us away. You could have punished me for what I did. Instead, you offered forgiveness and love. That is a greater gift than I deserved. Then we are both getting more than we deserve," he said with a smile. "Perhaps that is what grace looks like." That night, after the small celebration had ended and Rose had been tucked into bed, Edmund and I walked through the gardens together as husband and wife. The roses were in bloom despite the late season, their scent heavy on the cool evening air. We walked in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly beautiful flower or simply to stand close together under the stars. "I thought I would never have this," Edmund said quietly. "After Helena died, I believed I was meant to be alone, that I had used up my chance at happiness and would spend the rest of my days managing an estate and fulfilling obligations. The idea that I might have love and family and joy again seemed impossible. Perhaps some things are meant to come twice," I suggested, "second chances for those brave enough to take them." He turned to face me, pulling me close until we stood chest to chest in the moonlight. "I was not brave. I was terrified when you walked back into my life. Terrified of feeling too much, of being hurt again, of discovering that what we had before was merely memory turned gold by time." "And now?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Now I know that what we had was real, imperfect and complicated and damaged by time and circumstance, but real. And what we have now is real too. Different, perhaps, shaped by years of separation and the child we created, but no less true." He kissed me again, deeper this time, with all the passion we had denied ourselves during the weeks of careful distance. I melted into him, into the warmth and strength and familiar scent that I had carried in my memory for 10 years. This was home, I realized. Not the manor with its 100 rooms, but this. Edmund's arms around me, his heart beating against mine, the certainty that we belonged together despite everything that had tried to tear us apart. When we finally returned to the house, Rose was waiting at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, supposedly asleep, but clearly having stayed awake to see us return. Edmund scooped her up without comment, carrying her back to her room while she chattered happily about the wedding and her new dress and the cake she had eaten. I followed them, watching father and daughter together, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that it almost hurt. This was what I had wanted to give Rose all along, a father who loved her, a home where she belonged, a family that would weather whatever storms society threw at us. Edmund tucked Rose into bed with practiced ease, as though he had been doing it all her life rather than mere weeks. He kissed her forehead and promised to take her riding tomorrow if the weather held. She extracted a similar promise from me for a reading lesson, ever the scholar even at 9 years old. Then her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally claiming her, and we stood together watching her sleep. "She looks peaceful," I whispered, "for the first time since she fell ill, truly peaceful." "Because she feels safe," Edmund replied. "Children know when they are loved and protected. She knows now that she has both parents, that we are united in caring for her. That knowledge gives her a security she has never had before." We slipped from the room quietly and made our way to the master suite, the rooms we would now share as husband and wife. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once, this new beginning built on the ruins of what we had been. Edmund helped me with my dress, his fingers steady on the buttons, even though I felt him trembling slightly. I turned to face him when the gown fell away, standing before him in my undergarments, vulnerable in ways that went far beyond the physical. "I am not the girl you knew 10 years ago," I said, needing him to understand. "I am older, marked by hardship and worry. I have stretch marks from pregnancy. Gray hairs I try to hide. I am not what I was." "Good," he said firmly, "because I am not the man I was either. I am harder in some ways, softer in others. I have scars you cannot see and grief that still catches me by surprise. We are both different people than we were, but perhaps that is not a tragedy. Perhaps that is simply what it means to live and survive and eventually find each other again." He pulled me close, and I felt the truth of his words in the way our bodies fit together, familiar yet changed. We made love slowly, tenderly, relearning each other with patient hands and gentle words. It was nothing like the desperate passion of our youth, that frantic coupling in stolen moments before dawn. This was deeper, richer, built on foundation of shared pain and hard-won forgiveness. Afterwards, we lay tangled together in the darkness, his hand tracing lazy patterns on my bare shoulder. The future stretched before us, uncertain in many ways. Society would not quickly forgive or forget. We would face cut cards and closed doors. Rose would grow up knowing she had been born in scandal, even if our marriage had legitimized her. But we would face it together. That was the gift we had been given, the second chance we had fought for. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not freedom from judgment, but the strength to endure it. Not erasure of the past, but the courage to build something new despite it. "I love you," I whispered into the darkness. "I loved you then. I loved you during all the years between, and I love you now. Whatever comes, that will not change." Edmund's arms tightened around me. "I love you too, and I love our daughter, and I choose this life with both of you, whatever the cost." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of late roses through the open window. Somewhere in the house, Rose slept peacefully in her bed, dreaming perhaps of horses and books and the family she finally had, And here in the master suite, Edmund and I held each other through the night. Two people who had found their way back to each other against all odds and chosen to believe that love could be stronger than shame, forgiveness deeper than betrayal, and second chances worth every sacrifice required to claim them. The scandal did not fade quickly. It took years before certain doors reopened to us, before Rose could enter society without whispers following her every move. But Edmund never wavered in his support, never showed regret for the choice he had made. And as Rose grew into a remarkable young woman, intelligent and kind and utterly sure of her worth despite the circumstances of her birth, I knew we had done right by her. She married well at 22 to a younger son of good family who loved her for herself and cared nothing for old gossip. Edmund walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and I stood beside them both, watching our daughter begin her own new chapter. That night, after the wedding celebration had ended and the house was quiet again, Edmund and I returned to the gardens where we had walked on our own wedding night so many years before. The roses were in bloom again, as they always were in late summer, filling the air with their sweet scent. "We did well with her," Edmund said quietly. "Despite everything, despite all our mistakes and the obstacles we faced, Rose grew into someone extraordinary." "She had you as a father," I replied. "That made all the difference." "She had both of us," he corrected. "She had a mother who sacrificed everything to protect her, even when that protection was misguided. And she had parents who loved her enough to choose honesty and unity over pride and convention." We stood in comfortable silence, older now, marked by years but still together, still choosing each other every day. The scandal that had once seemed so devastating had faded into background noise, just another story in a city full of them. What remained was this: a family built from ruins, a love that had survived everything meant to destroy it, a second chance that had become a complete life. I thought of the night I had returned to Ashford Manor in a borrowed gown and mask, desperate and terrified and certain I had no right to ask for his help. I thought of Edmund demanding I remove the mask, his shock and fury at seeing my face. I thought of all the pain and recrimination that had followed, the hard conversations and harder truths. And I thought of now, standing beside my husband in the garden where our daughter had played as a child, knowing that despite everything, despite all the ways we had hurt each other and ourselves, we had found our way to something real and lasting. Some stories do not have neat endings. Some wounds never fully heal. But some loves are strong enough to carry the weight of imperfection and still stand. Edmund and I had that kind of love, tested and scarred and more valuable for having survived. He took my hand, his fingers warm and familiar around mine. "Ready to go inside?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "Let us stay here a while longer." In the garden where it all began and where it continues, where the roses bloom every year regardless of what anyone thinks, where we learned that some things once lost can be found again if you are brave enough to look. So we stayed, two people who had been given a second chance and used it wisely, two people who had chosen love over pride, forgiveness over anger, hope over despair, two people who had learned painfully and slowly that the masks we wear to protect ourselves sometimes prevent us from seeing what is right before us, waiting to be claimed. The night deepened around us, stars emerging one by one overhead. And in the garden of Ashford Manor, beneath the roses that bore our daughter's name, Edmund and I stood together as we would for all our remaining years. Together, finally and irrevocably together, and it was enough.